In our previous lecture, we examined the rise of communist China under Mao's leadership and the remarkable ways in which Marxist ideology was adopted to Chinese conditions. In today's lecture, we'll examine a similar case, and in fact a linked case, that of Cambodia and the Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge regime. This was a regime lasting 3 years in duration, which was, even by the standards of the dictatorships we've been discussing in this course, strange in its nature and distinctive. And I think we need to return to that thought that we've brought up several times before, the notion that we need to consider the regimes which we've been discussing in relation to one another. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia would seek to outdo all other revolutionary regimes that had come before, and most immediately sought to surpass Mao's China. In Southeast Asia, Cambodian communist leaders who had been educated in France and who were led by the mysterious leader Pol Pot would turn their entire country into a social experiment. When they came to power in 1975, the Khmer Rouge declared that they were starting a new epoch in human history. They would build a pure racial utopia, and to this end, they emptied the cities, expelled people into the countryside, purged the population again and again of those who were considered enemies of the people. They would, in the last analysis, end up causing the deaths of some 2 million people in Cambodia, or over a quarter of the population. We need to consider, first of all, Cambodia's longer history, its past. Because though the Khmer Rouge announced that they were building the bright future, in many ways, the idealized rural paradise, which supposedly had existed in some previous age, was a model to be striven after as well. In the past, a Khmer empire had ruled in Indochina from the 9th to the 13th century, so there was a glimmer of bygone glories, but then the country had come under the rule of the Thais from outside. Cambodia then became a French protectorate in the 19th century, and it was occupied by Japan in World War II. Afterwards, it would become an independent kingdom in 1955. The Cold War conflict that we've outlined in a previous lecture would then hit Cambodia very hard with dire results. Though Cambodia declared neutrality in the Vietnam conflict raging next door, it was nonetheless infiltrated by the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese communists, and indeed sections of the Ho Chi Minh Trail supplying the insurgents ran through Cambodian territory. Allies of the Vietnamese communists, at least at this stage, were the Khmer Rouge. They were the Cambodian communists who were active from 1963. In 1970, the Cambodian monarchy was overthrown, and American and South Vietnamese forces also intervened secretly in the country. American bombing raids directed against the movement of communist forces in Cambodia took a dreadful toll on civilians and destabilized the Cambodian government. When the United States withdrew from Vietnam and South Vietnam collapsed, replaced by a communist control of the entire country, the Khmer Rouge now moved to take control in Cambodia as well. In April 1975, as the government collapsed, the Khmer Rouge entered the capital, Phnom Penh, and began to put their revolution into action. Their new state was renamed Democratic Kampuchea. And I've sometimes mentioned in lectures that it's especially a bad sign when a state needs to call itself democratic. That's usually a sign of bad things to come. And yet, many Cambodians felt that surely after such dislocation, after such turmoil, after such violence, the Khmer Rouge surely would be offering a better way of life and at least stability. The Khmer Rouge were a group about which little was known. They moved forward to take control of the country, dressed in their distinctive black uniforms, in checkered red and white scarves, and their plain sandals, a very austere uniform. The population awaited to see what would happen. And indeed, what happened next, what we'll be describing in the lecture today, was something that at the time remained largely unknown to the outside world. Secrecy, shadowy realities would be a hallmark of the Khmer Rouge, and especially their mysterious leader, Pol Pot. The man who would later be known as Pol Pot, which was an assumed revolutionary name that didn't have any specific meaning, was simply a pseudonym that had been assumed by a man who was born as Saloth Sar to a farmer family, apparently undistinguished, along the border with Thailand. The man who became Pol Pot later claimed that he had spent 2 years as a Buddhist monk before going on the route of his new personality. And if so, this would be an intriguing similarity to other cases of leaders we've seen who had had a religious education and were perhaps affected by the forms of religious doctrine and belief which they had observed. On turning to politics, the man who became Pol Pot cut himself off entirely from his family and his earlier life. In many ways, this foreshadowed what would happen with Cambodia itself. A radical break would lead to radical isolation and a cutting off from the rest of the outside world. Years later, his family would be stunned to realize that the leader of the country was in fact their family member. Pol Pot's turn to radicalism was also intriguing. In the course of the 1940s, he was active in the resistance against the French colonizers, directed by Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Vietnamese communists. In 1946, Pol Pot became a member of the Communist Party of Cambodia. In 1949, he left the country to study in France. This was a contrast to Mao's relatively more limited experience. Pol Pot's years in the West clearly shaped his ideas. While in France, he was supposed to be studying radio-electronic engineering, but it seems that he neglected his studies and instead devoted himself to communist political activities. There was a vibrant communist movement in France at the time. After failing his examinations at university, Pol Pot returned to Cambodia in 1953 and taught at a private school at Phnom Penh, meanwhile beginning to organize underground and to agitate for the Communist Party in Cambodia. The Communist Party had been founded in 1960. By 1963, Pol Pot had become its general secretary, a man working underground and excelling in such activities. Pol Pot became prime minister of the new regime established in Cambodia from 1975 right up until its overthrow in 1979. Now, when we consider Pol Pot in the context of some of the other dictators whom we've discussed in our lectures, we see a figure who's really in remarkable contrast to the others. Throughout his rise to power, as well as the period of his dominance in Cambodia, Pol Pot remained obscure, shadowy, unknown. In contrast to such dictators as Hitler or Stalin or Mao, no cult of personality was encouraged around Pol Pot. This man, an anonymous comrade, as it were, by his very unknown nature, his shadowy identity, was supposed to be all the more imposing. Once he's here, Pol Pot diverging from the models of some earlier dictatorships, the very dictatorships in some cases that he wished to overtake. He was perhaps carving out a new path for his new regime. No statues, no omnipresent portraits were established to this shadowy leader of the Khmer Rouge. And as I've mentioned before, his family would later be shocked to discover that this man, whom they knew well from his youth, was in fact the leader of the country. This was perhaps also indicative of the radical break which the Khmer Rouge announced they were bringing to the country itself. And this was summed up in the term applied to the beginning of their rule, the year zero. We see here perhaps echoes or references back to the revolutionary calendar of the French Revolution marking the beginning of a new regime, a new age in human history. The Khmer Rouge announced that they were bringing something entirely new and unprecedented to Cambodia, but paradoxically also returning the country to the sort of rural, idyllic conditions it might have known in some bygone age. And as we've mentioned before, many ordinary Cambodians, in fact, were receptive at first to the message that at long last stability, peace, and harmony could be at hand. It would take a while before the full scope of the ambitions of the black-clad Khmer Rouge would become known, because they were obsessively secretive in their actions. Many of their recruits were young boys and girls, recruited at the age of 12 or younger, and quite deliberately cut off, as Pol Pot himself had cut himself off from their families and from the society and the sort of context they had known before. In the tragedy that would unfold in Cambodia, there would be a marked generational dimension. The young would be turned into killers of the society which they now had been turned against. The ruling body that was to oversee the transformation of Cambodian society was a shadowy entity. Very little was known about it. It denied aspects of its own existence in its propaganda. This entity was known as the Angkar, meaning the organization. As little was known about it, one thing was stressed in its propaganda, and that was that this organization was all-powerful and would provide for the Cambodian people. In one phrase that was used in propaganda, the Angkar, or organization, was called the mother-father of the people. More than any parent, this government would steer the development of Cambodians. The aim of the policies that would unfold in communist Cambodia would be not only an imitation of aspects of Mao's Great Leap Forward, the attempted mobilization of the countryside and a great leap into the future of industrialization and productive agriculture, but much more than that, an attempt to surpass Mao's model as well. And this would be accompanied by ferocious revolutionary violence. The Khmer Rouge mounted immediately a campaign of what they called ruralization. Cities they viewed as tainted, full of impurities, full of deviations, full of a lapse in those virtues that were associated with the peasantry. We see here, in other words, a great deviation, though it wouldn't have been recognized at the time by these activists, from classical Marxism. We'll recall that Marx had emphasized that the workers, especially in the cities, were the vanguard of the future, while the peasants were often denounced as being in a state of rural idiocy or retardation. Instead, the Khmer Rouge were taking Marx's ideas and changing them to fit their realities and their vision of the utopian future. The cities thus were slated for annihilation. They were ordered to be emptied out in 24 hours. And with tremendous dislocation, involving even the evacuation of hospital patients in their beds, the cities were indeed turned out, their populations expelled. 60% of the entire population of the country was exiled from its earlier place of residence, and Phnom Penh, the capital city, a great cosmopolitan city of 2 million people, was in short order deserted, silent, and vacated. The social transformation of Cambodia had begun. What happened to those people who were now exiled to the countryside? Even this transformation in their circumstances didn't mean that they could escape their former identity. Former city dwellers, now thrust into a new context that many of them had not known before, were labeled, even in their rural exile, the new people. And as such, they were segregated from the peasantry, who were judged more healthy, more virtuous. These new people would be uprooted again and again and deported from one part of the countryside to another, In the process of these repeated deportations, many of them were decimated. They had few supports or people to draw upon in unfamiliar regions as a way of securing survival. The fury of the revolutionaries also focused on those whom they saw as especially tainted, those who had moved away from their original roots, those in particular who had been tainted, as they saw it, through education. And what amounted to a manhunt now began of those from the earlier Cambodian society who were educated. Those, for instance, who spoke foreign languages. French had often been the language of advancement in the colonial period or of cultivation. All such people were now targeted for persecution or extermination. The wearing of eyeglasses, in particular, could be the distinguishing feature that would slate one for execution, because such a person clearly was one who had need of such corrective lenses for reading or for education or other subversive activities. Such so-called enemies of the people faced a dire fate. Religion was also focused upon as a target. Buddhist monks, as well as members of the minority religions who were represented in Cambodia, including Muslims as well as Catholics, were persecuted and suspected of being enemies of the people. The fury of the revolutionaries would also begin to target ethnic minorities. And here we see some of the energies of nationalism beginning to perhaps combine with a revolutionary ideology. The ethnic minorities of the Chinese and Vietnamese were now also eliminated, viewed as impure, imperfectly Cambodian. Executions now became commonplace. Many of the executions took place without the benefit, as it were, of modern technology, but instead were meted out with the most primitive of objects and tools. Agricultural tools, the hoes in particular, would be used in executions in which the victim would be struck from behind with a blow aimed at the neck, and it's been suggested symbolically that this mode of execution was supposed to be reminiscent of the guillotine of the French Revolution and its hygienic, as it were, mode of killing. One thing in particular was an object of pride for the Khmer Rouge functionaries who meted out these revolutionary executions. They prided themselves on being polite as they did so. This was supposed to emphasize that this form of revolutionary justice was not personal, was not motivated by hatred, but rather by the purity of revolutionary rationality and revolutionary fervor. Those who were not immediately executed were instead sent to prisons strewn throughout the country. Conditions in some of these prisons were so bad indeed that many guards are said to have died there as well from the privations. One riveting record of the terrors of the Khmer Rouge regime are the photographs which were carefully, bureaucratically recorded, filed, and organized by the Khmer Rouge administrators of these prisons, showing the faces of those who were imprisoned there or who faced imminent execution. And one views picture after picture of such photographs, men, women, children, mothers and their children. One sees a range of dismaying human emotions: fear, anxiety, resignation, the faces of people who faced a dreadful fate. It is a riveting and terrifying documentary legacy of the Khmer Rouge. Pits where the bodies of those who were executed were thrown came to be called the killing fields of Cambodia, and the country was dotted with them. Hundreds of mass graves, both large as well as small, are scattered throughout the land, and indeed the newspapers of the recent months have conveyed the reports of ever more such mass graves being discovered today. It's estimated that some 2 million died as a result of the Khmer Rouge policies, out of a total population of 7 million in Cambodia. As a result of the executions, the killings, hunger, and abuse. Some recent estimates by historians and students of this period in this country range even higher due to the new evidence emerging in those recently discovered mass graves I mentioned a moment ago. So some estimates suggest that even that figure of 2 million might need to be revised significantly upwards. What was this all in aid of? The promise was the Khmer Rouge, in this brutal fashion, by endorsing revolutionary violence, would create a new society. To make that new society, the regime would follow radical measures to purify the human material of the people within, while the world would be cut off from the country would be isolated, would form a universe of its own, and seeking autarky, perfect self-sufficiency, Khmer Rouge felt that they had the chance of creating the world anew in Cambodia. There were symbolic actions that immediately made clear their resolve. Money, currency, was abolished in 1 week upon their coming to power, to be replaced by a new form of economic equality. Total collectivization of land was decreed, not the measures of the Soviet Union or in China, which had been extensive enough, but it still allowed some private plots to the peasants. No, total collectivization was demanded. In the communes, as had been the case in communist China, people ate in collective canteens, in dining halls where they were not separated into families, but rather worked in a collective. And there they shared the same thin rice soup that represented the starvation diet of ordinary Cambodians. All Cambodians, moreover, were ordered to wear black clothes on the model of the Khmer Rouge themselves, to shed vestiges of individuality, to instead become uniform, to become one in their appearance. Religion, writing, education all disappeared. In their place, the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot, in many senses echoing Mao's insistence upon will and its capacity to achieve remarkable transformations, argued that revolutionary fervor itself would be able to bring the benefits of higher civilization, medicine, industrialization, even in the hands of young children. And indeed, the Khmer Rouge sought to control even the most intimate parts of people's lives. Only arranged marriages that were approved by Khmer Rouge officials were allowed, and those who engaged in relationships outside of the bonds of such sanctioned relationships would then be punished most harshly. Individualism was seen as something that needed to be overcome. And in chilling propaganda slogans, the Khmer Rouge didn't hide how they viewed human nature, or indeed the individuals under their own control, but instead emphasized their disregard for the individual. One potent slogan stated, "Losing you is not a loss. Keeping you is not a gain." The individual was relegated to a revolutionary mass that was to be formed and remade. People were seen as human material for the revolution. What were the results of this revolutionary fervor, this determination to create the world anew in the Khmer Rouge? Well, as one might have predicted, construction and agricultural projects undertaken throughout the country were marked by that same irrationality and pseudoscience and that reliance on will triumphing over the constraints of matter that we've seen in other regimes steered by their ideology rather than by pragmatism, rationality, or compromise. The collapse of agriculture as a result of the disastrous policies of the Khmer Rouge here, as was also the case in China or in the terror famine in Ukraine and the Soviet Union, once again led to instances of famine, cases of horrifying cannibalism in these crisis situations. And the Khmer Rouge government reacted in ways that might have made sense in terms of their ideology, but which represented yet another ratcheting up of violence against the subject population. These catastrophes in agriculture and other projects led the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot to suspect sabotage. The movement began to comb through the civilian population even more determinedly and led them to start purging themselves of ever more alleged enemies within the ranks of the party. The prisons soon now filled with former members, former true believers in the Khmer Rouge regime itself. As we've noted before, the revolution could be a mother that eats her children, as had been the case in the French Revolution, a phenomenon now being echoed in the Khmer Rouge regime. And that regime now neared its collapse. That collapse, however, came from a surprising quarter. It came precisely at the hands of fellow communists. After the Khmer Rouge, perhaps out of desperation, began attacking Vietnam and its communist regime in border clashes, the Vietnamese government now invaded in 1978. To many, this came as a surprise. This was a refutation of communist international solidarity as communist Vietnam invaded communist Cambodia. And soon the Khmer Rouge government was overthrown by the invading Vietnamese in January of 1979, bringing its 3 years of rule at long last to an end. The Vietnamese now set up a communist puppet regime which broke with the Khmer Rouge, denounced their crimes, and was friendly to Vietnam. But the Khmer Rouge story did not end there. These red Cambodians, the Khmer Rouge, would continue their fight. Even after their overthrow, their guerrilla forces retreated into the jungles and continued to fight in the border areas and even from within Thailand, neighboring country, until 1992. At long last, a United Nations brokered plan sought to solve this continuing struggle and conflict by including the Khmer Rouge in elections in Cambodia for a new state. What happened to the shadowy leader, Pol Pot? In 1997, under circumstances that are still shrouded with mystery and obscurity to this very day, Pol Pot was arrested by his own associates and allies. Some suggested that his condemnation for treason and then his subsequent house arrest were merely a show trial without serious intent on the part of his former allies to hold him responsible for his actions, but was instead intended as a fig leaf for the new respectability that the Khmer Rouge aimed to achieve. In April 1998, it was announced to the world that Pol Pot had died in the jungle in mysterious circumstances of natural causes. He was never brought to public trial. In an interview that was held with Pol Pot shortly before he died, he was asked about his legacy. He had what amounted to last words as well. In this case, he acknowledged that many looked on him as a man who was responsible for many deaths, a man whose policies had yielded suffering, but he tearfully announced that he was not to blame. He had trusted subordinates who had done bad things, and that this was his legacy. Not a show of remorse, but rather a shedding of responsibility. In terms of responsibility and responses, we need to ask, how did the world respond to the unfolding of the Cambodian tragedy? In part because of the intense secrecy of the regime, its shutting off of the country from the outside world, news of Khmer Rouge activities would filter out only very slowly. But relief workers in neighboring countries started to observe a horrifying phenomenon. Refugees fleeing the Khmer Rouge regime tended to tell the same stories again and again. And though their stories boggled the imagination, the sheer weight of accumulated witness testimony slowly allowed outside countries to form an impression of what had been unfolding within the country. And nonetheless, the response of the outside world had been ambivalent, to say the least. As part of Cold War politics, Thailand, China, as well as the United States continued to support the Khmer Rouge long after their overthrow by the Vietnamese communists, seeing this group, criminal as they might have been before, as many considered it, a counterweight to the Vietnamese. The question is now, at long last, how will these events be remembered? How will individuals be held responsible? In Cambodia today, memorials are set up throughout the country. The skeletons, the skulls of those who died in the killing fields are displayed in open-air museums. The documentation of the executions, including those haunting pictures of the condemned taken by their executioners that I mentioned, are preserved as an eloquent witness to the tragedy. But only slowly has movement grown to hold some of those who committed these crimes responsible. Resistance to trials of the surviving Khmer Rouge leaders still continues, and progress has been very slow. The resistance derives from different quarters, both in Cambodia and abroad. Especially the Chinese government has objected to the setting up of such courts. Some Cambodian politicians suggest that indeed it's perhaps better to bury the past, to allow bygones to be bygones, and to forget this legacy of killing. Many ordinary Cambodians cannot agree. As they see killers still among them, walking free, they raise the question of how a country can steer towards a healthy future without dealing with the ghosts of its past. In our next lecture, we'll consider 3 other trajectories of communist rule in East Germany, the Soviet Union, and North Korea.